Tensions are up in Moscow after a rebel mercenary group made their way into the city, challenging the government of Russian President Vladimir Putin.
One U.S. official believes that the aborted mutiny in Russia has exposed fresh cracks to the leadership of Vladimir Putin.
We saw the rising tensions over several months that led to this, but exactly where this goes, we don't know. But what we do know is that we've seen real cracks emerge. Again, a direct challenge to Putin's authority.
Two government agencies are keeping a close watch on maritime schools to ensure their compliance with the standards of the European Maritime Safety Agency or EMSA.
Hindi dahil sa napanatili natin ang recognition ng European Union, sa pagkakataong ito ay magiging kampante na po tayo. Gaya po na ibinahagi sa sulat po ng European Commission, ipagpapatuloy po natin yung pagpapatupad ng mga improvement kaugnay po sa mga policies and regulations natin.
Coming from an at times tense relationship with the previous regime, the European Union is expecting deeper ties with the Philippines under the Marcos administration. What initiatives does it have in mind to nurture these ties? We sit down with the EU ambassador to the Philippines tonight on The Chiefs. Welcome to The Chiefs. Ako po si Robbie Alampay. Kasama po natin ngayon dito sa studio here in Mandaluyong. Ed Lingao of One News and Lucy Cruz Valdez ang aming hepe po sa News 5.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Happy week.
Ano? Sige, Ed.
Happy pre-holiday.
Sige. Sa 20...
Wednesday,
sa 28.
bukas. Holiday.
Yan. Isablay ka na.
Okay.
Sablay ka na.
Dinit ko ba? Dinit ko.
Mali. Nagkamali ka Wednesday ngayon. Ano ka ba? Wednesday
Sorry, ngayon na pala yun.
Kaya ako umiiwas Anyway,
Ed, ano bang balita this week?
of course, developments in Russia with the Prigozhin finally striking a deal and having himself exiled to
alam mo naman,
Belarus.
when it comes to all things military, whether dito sa Pilipinas or abroad, ikaw ang go-to namin. Explain mo lang, brief background sa Wagner. This is a mercenary.
Tell us about mercenaries
What, you know what's so interesting
in
about
this
it?
day and age.
Yeah. They call themselves now private military contractors. Of course,
Mercenaries.
Yeah, but they date way back. The Greeks had mercenaries, the Romans had mercenaries,
diba?
yeah. And now they're called PMCs, and
it gives them a cloak of legitimacy, no?
Well,
really, kasi
a lot of-
mercenary.
yeah, it
Diba?
sounds bad, diba?
Oo.
It sounds like the wars in Africa where you had the Belgians and Frenchmen and Americans and British mercenaries going in and wreaking havoc. They're still used by a lot of countries these days, basically because it gives them freedom to dissociate with whatever activities have to be done, whether covertly or overtly, in their interest.
They call that plausible deniability.
Kung may war crimes, halimbawa.
Yeah.
Oo.
Hindi kami.
Yeah,
Or
and
inflation.
also it's also in terms of pesos and cents or dollars and cents, it's more cost efficient for a lot of these countries. Although mercenaries are typically paid much higher than your regular foot soldier, in the end it's more cost efficient because you don't pay pension, you don't pay benefits, and so on down the line, which is a huge amount when it comes to the regular army.
Okay, ngayon ito, yung nangyari sa Russia kasi medyo nakakagulat.
Talaga.
Nung unang nakikita ko yung mga unang nakikita ko ng mga links diyan, lalo na sa YouTube, inisip ko, fake news ba to?
Di ba?
Ako rin. Parang siseryosohin ko ba to? Tsaka, chef siya ni, I mean, friends sila.
He was head of the
Putin.
catering and restaurant
Putin.
business that catered to the needs of the Kremlin and visiting
And they
dignitaries.
Okay, pero bottom
Yeah.
line, ano nangyari over the weekend? That was an attempted coup? What was that?
Well,
National Defense Minister nila ang
Pinakaaway
target.
niya. And he was
Yeah.
careful at the start to make it look like he was fighting the MOD, the Ministry of Defense, and not Putin himself. He was saying that Putin was being fooled by his generals. May konting hinanakit dun eh. There was some friction in the last several months between the MOD, the Defense Ministry, and Prigozhin. Sabi ni Prigozhin at one point, they were running out of ammunition in Bakhmut because the Wagner group
Kami
was
na nga
tip of the
lumalaban
spear.
para sa inyo.
Oo nga,
Kami
kami
pa ngayon
nga
ang
nanalo
nagugutom.
dyan.
Oh,
So may ganun
Exactly.
siyang hinanakit. Is it accurate or not? Well, it's really hard to say.
Oo,
Pero may ganung buod.
tapos humantong doon sa, parang binomba kami minsan ng
Yes.
mga aeroplano
But
nyo.
if you look at the background of Wagner, it's interesting. They started in 2014 with 250 men.
And
By
now?
2016, there were 1,000. By 2023, there were 50,000.
Okay.
That's
Anyway.
1/4 of the armed forces of the Philippines.
Mauubos ang oras natin kakausap dito.
sorry.
Pero
I should
ako
put
isa
it
na
out.
lang ang pinagtatakaan ko. Let's say you have this private army. Di ba? Obviously, he's getting paid a lot of money. But how do you enjoy that money? If you, where do you go? Is there actually a place where you can, other
Ito
than...
nga sasabihin
There are
ko,
many places to
go.
I'm sure the reason that he even did this was because he probably wasn't scared that Putin would get back at him. Which, to
Maybe
me,
he knows the
proves that
skeletons.
There's something,
There's
you know.
really something more to it. And Putin is probably also holding back in a way, knowing that there's a
They
relationship
know each other's
behind it.
skeletons.
Yes.
diba?
Yeah.
Another interesting thing. Okay, the Wagner group for the longest time was armed, transported, and trained by the Russian military. But under Russian law, mercenary groups are illegal.
Chef, di naman sasabihin na kahit na anong gobyerno,
Russian ba siya?
You know,
Is he Russian?
Yeah, he is.
He
He was born in St. Petersburg, I think.
Why Wagner?
Wagner, I've read different accounts, but one account says that one of the co-founders is a staunch believer in the Third Reich of Hitler, and Hitler loved Wagner.
I see. Okay. Anyway, sige, save natin yung ibang mga tanong natin. We may get some, we'll obviously keep talking about this, but when we come back, we will speak to the EU ambassador, Luc Perron. And not just about this, of course, we'll talk about EU relations with the Philippines. Don't miss this conversation. The chiefs will be right back.
Welcome back to the Chiefs, and it is an honor for us tonight to have him over. Welcome, His Excellency Luc Perron. Did I say that right? Yes, Ambassador and head of the delegation of the European Union, or EU, to the Philippines. Good evening and welcome to the Chiefs.
Good evening.
Welcome,
Nice
sir.
to be here.
Good evening, sir. Welcome to the studio.
Absolutely.
And as you might have heard, we were deep in conversation
Long conversation, it turns out.
on Wagner. So let me ask you about that. What is your take on what happened recently in Russia in regard to Wagner, and this coup?
I think my boss, Josep Borrell, expressed it the best. He said Putin created a monster, and the monster came back to bite him.
Yes.
And this is the way we pretty much look at it, with concern, because as much as a strong Putin might have thought that he could get away with anything, weakened Putin running a country with nuclear capability is something that is worrying for the world.
And of course, the next logical question is, how do you think this will affect the ongoing Russia-Ukraine war, now that there is somebody internally who's in conflict with no less than Putin?
I think we are monitoring the situation very closely with our friends and allies, but we remain unwavering in our support for Ukraine, in full solidarity with a country that has been a victim of a senseless aggression by the Russian Federation. We hope, of course, for a peaceful outcome, but it's already a human tragedy.
It is.
And that has impacted the rest of the world as well.
Are you saying that the EU is not seeing any end in sight in the short term?
I think it's not for the EU to tell. I think what is very important is that we remain united in support of Ukraine, and Ukraine at some point will determine its own fate. But for us, what is important is to remain in full solidarity with Ukraine.
Yeah, but certainly, of course, I think there's a lot of interest in it, because if there's anything that people have taken out of it, is that pain and crisis anywhere in the world affects all of us. You mentioned, and if we could ask you to expand a little bit more, it's one thing to build our scenarios on the strength of Putin, but what are the new scenarios, if we could even at least quantify it, that will give us fits with an unstable Russia?
I refuse to speculate. At this stage, it's very important that we monitor the situation, we remain calm and determined. I do not predict the impacts of the current situation, internal situation in Russia to the conflict.
Of course, sir, we do understand. We don't want to go into speculation. And I also take note of what you said a while ago, that Putin created the monster and the monster bit him back. But also on the other hand, there are those who would say that there could be even more cause for concern whenever there is anything that puts everything into an unstable situation, especially with nuclear powers, with nuclear weapons on the table all the time. It's one thing for example, for the Russian leadership to be possibly toppled, but it's another thing for Russian leadership to be challenged for the medium term, with the instability and all, and something might suddenly happen. I'm wondering whether these are also the EU's concerns, the concerns of the EU leaders, that something unstable could result from this challenge to Putin's leadership.
That's why I think you have observed that the European Union, their leaders, have been extremely guarded in their comments. There have been no manifestation of joy or whatever at the prospect of the Russian leadership to be challenged. It was more a reaction of concern, and this is something that we will continue to monitor very closely, because after all, this is our neighborhood.
Especially, sir, since that Prigozhin has not been taken off the table. I mean, he just transferred locations. He was, I don't know, given amnesty of some sort, but he's still there, and his group is still huge, and that's something to reckon with in the future.
Yes, absolutely, and we have encountered Wagner in other parts of the world.
Yes.
For example, in the Central African Republic. Again, Wagner was created by Putin to serve the interests of the Russian Federation in different parts of the world, to create trouble sometimes. But we look at with some concern at the current events.
Externally now, going back to the Russia-Ukraine war and what EU has been doing in terms of the sanctions that have been imposed, how would you evaluate Russia's behavior in view of the sanctions that you have imposed, EU has imposed? Are they effective? Are they working?
This is always a debate whether sanctions are effective, and one of the difficulty is that probably sanction is a misnomer. We have taken some measures to influence the calculus of the elite in Russia in order to influence the decision making in Russia. And I would think, yes, up to a point it works, because you have to compare to the alternative. The alternative is doing nothing. Just talk and reaffirm your concern and doing nothing. So if you compare that with having measures in place, which are freezing of assets, restriction in terms of visa, and other types of measures, definitely these are effective.
On the other hand, of course, one of the indirect, if you will, impacts of the sanctions have to do with the price of oil. And the ones most affected are, of course, the non-oil producing nations, such as the Philippines.
Starting with the European Union,
yes,
which was one of the main importers of energy from Russia.
Right.
We have definitely lower imports drastically, I would say. We want to get away from our dependence
right.
on Russia in terms of energy. We have been deeply impacted by our own measures, if you wish. But that was the price to pay for a higher purpose, which was basically to change the calculus of Vladimir Putin.
How did you manage that? I mean, in the Philippines, we're still trying to figure it out. We're an oil exporting country. All our energy needs, almost all of it, coming from abroad.
How do you manage what?
How do you manage that? How do you manage with cutting down on dependence on, for example, Russian oil?
Cutting down on consumption, diversifying our energy imports, including gas, for example, depending much more on Norway, for example, and other producers. This is part of the story, and of course, higher prices for us. But I would like to come back to the measures because they have been carefully calibrated, in particular not to impact directly the Russian population. So no sanctions, no measures on pharmaceutical products, for example, or health devices and so on. So that's something that we have been very careful to
So are
calibrate.
the elite actually reacting? Are they feeling the squeeze? Because they're the ones against which these sanctions or pressures have been put on, right?
I do believe, well, they're all only indirect evidence of that, but probably the impact that it had on the economic and political elite of Russia was significant to the point that they put pressure on Putin to find a way out.
Yeah, we've been looking at this, as you said, from the calculus of Russia. Looking at it from the other side of the crisis there, in particular Ukraine, and Ukraine now entering the European Union. What do we see beyond the current crisis, beyond the war between Ukraine and Russia? What do you see changing there over the long term, not just for Ukraine, but all the other countries in that region?
Every European country has a vocation to become a member of the European Union. So Ukraine is one of these countries. There is a certain process to access the European Union. It's a very integrated entity. But definitely Ukraine and other countries in the Balkans, for example, have a vocation to become members of the European Union.
Okay, let's move closer now to what really concerns the country. Of course, we'll have to ask you how the EU views the new administration, especially in light of the fact that during the former president's headship, your relationship was quite rocky. And in fact, I remember in 2016, the president said some really let's just say
colorful words.
Yes, colorful.
Hostile even. I mean, I think we
that's
can
a word.
say even
Hostile words against the EU. And we saw some direct, actually flows out of the country in terms of the investment. There was an outflow to the point where foreign direct investments even turned negative as far as the EU is concerned.
Right.
Has that been reversed, or
bear in mind, I arrived in the country in 2020. So it was President Duterte then. I presented my credentials to President Duterte, and I didn't witness any of that since I arrived.
Was he friendlier to you?
Well, I never had to complain about the courtesy of the president and his administration, and actually we have done a lot during the presidency of Mr. Duterte. We have signed a partnership and cooperation agreement in 2018 under Duterte. We had many meetings in this context. We donated 27 million doses of vaccines during President Duterte.
Right.
We signed financing agreements up to, if my memory is correct, 130 million euros during President Duterte. So I don't want to contrast too much the previous administration and the current administration. It's not for me as a diplomat anyway to write the scorecard of the new administration.
Not too much, at least.
And certainly there has been an intensification of engagement between the Marcos administration and the European Union. Very early in its mandate, President Marcos visited Brussels in December of 2022. He met there with our leaders, but also the business community. He's been very clear on his willingness to further the economic and investment cooperation with the European Union. So there has been, in general, an intensification of international engagement of the new administration, with the new administration under President Marcos, and the European Union has been no exception to that. So we're looking forward to furthering our cooperation with the Philippines.
But it must be an objective statement, Mr. Ambassador, to say that certainly the tenor has changed. The temperature has come down. The rhetoric is not as heated. All of these are it doesn't have to come from you. I'll say it. Right? These are objective statements. I believe. I think it's fair. Let me put it this way: it must be convenient and a relief and certainly constructive to, as a diplomat, to not have to navigate the more heated language of the previous administration.
I must say that in my daily work, even during the previous administration, we had a very good level of interaction with the different departments of the Republic of the Philippines. So, but certainly the fact that there is a willingness on the part of the Marcos administration to re-engage with the world and including with Europe is something that makes my job probably easier. Not necessarily more interesting, but definitely easier.
Okay. Now, this is not comparing Mr. Marcos to Mr. Duterte, but trying to see a check on what Mr. Marcos said very early on in his term. He said that human rights will be a paramount matter for us, a paramount interest, and so on. We are 1 year into the Marcos administration now. Your assessment of the human rights situation now in the Philippines?
I think it's very obvious that very early on, the president indicated that, in particular, the war on drug would be conducted differently. We all believe that we need to fight illegal drugs, but the President Marcos made it very clear that he wanted a change of paradigm in terms of how the Republic of the Philippines would fight illegal drugs. And this is something, let's be frank, that was welcome in Europe. And also in very practical terms, the guidelines of the PNP and so on. Don't forget that we as European Union, we have been very much involved with the justice sector in the Philippines. We have cooperated since 2006, if I'm not mistaken, with the justice sector of the Philippines. So this is something that we care a lot about, and we are ready to work with the government of the Philippines. So that was definitely very welcome. And also the fact that, to be honest, that post-pandemic, we have had more direct contacts between, for example, the lawmakers in the European Union, the members of the European Parliament, and the lawmakers here, has also helped quite a bit. So it's very important to note that during the pandemic, there was very little direct contacts, very little direct engagement between the two sides.
In 2016 and 2017, at the height of the president's tirades against everybody, actually, there was a lot of talk or concern among Philippine businessmen and economists about the possible impact of the tirades on the GSP Plus, the general system of preferences, well, both with the US and also with the EU. I'm wondering how it is now that the temperature, as Robbie had said, has gone down significantly. And also the language has improved significantly.
In fact, I think we were suspended for a while, right?
That's also what I wanted to ask you. Was there any movement along those lines?
There was
along
never
suspension?
any suspension of the GSP Plus, which has been established, I think, in 2014, and which still in place, which concerns basically the exports by the Philippines. It's a one-way FTA, if you wish. It's
Tariff-free.
tariff-free exports from the Philippines to the European Union market, which is a market of 450 million people.
Right. Yes.
So it's quite significant. Actually, the surplus in trade for the Philippines is currently about 3 billion euros. So the GSP Plus is used by exporters in the Philippines to for the benefits of the Philippines. So that's quite significant. It was never interrupted. There were discussions among our legislators as to the suspension, but the suspension was never enacted.
Oh, yes.
So let's be clear on that. There will be a new legal framework for GSP Plus that will enter into force early next year. The Philippines, if the Philippines wants to continue to be a beneficiary of this trade preference, will have to reapply. So whatever assessment is taking place in our legislature about the performance of the Philippines against the criteria of this trade preference is very, very important. Therefore, very, very important to have a lot of dialogue between the legislature here and there.
So the present GSP is about to expire for the new one to come in,
and we have to apply.
Reapply, correct.
And what would be the criteria? Is there anything new in the criteria?
There is nothing new per se. There will be new conventions, but the conventions, international conventions on, political rights or labor rights and so on, or conventions that have been signed and ratified by the Republic of the Philippines. So that's not, in essence, a problem.
Okay.
And the Philippines has not done that for benefiting GSP Plus, because the government think it's a good thing to have in place. So basically what we look at is how these conventions are implemented in the Philippines. And we are very detailed as to, for example, the labor rights and political rights and so on and so forth.
Just for my education, what kind of products do we sell to the EU?
You sell lots of coconut products in different shapes and forms. Canned fish, very important, and electronic parts. These are the three main components of exports of the Philippines to the European Union.
Of course, I don't want to preempt anything because we will still have to apply and all that, and it will have to be decided in the negotiations. But given how things have gone in the last year since the change of administrations, does it look like are things looking up as far as applying for GSP Plus is concerned for the Philippines?
Are there major obstacles?
I represent the executive of the European Union. This is a decision by the legislative branch,
Certainly.
the Council and the European Parliament. So I cannot pronounce for them. So this is something that I cannot answer. But there is an additional element also to bear in mind. The fact that the Philippines will soon become a upper middle income country. I don't remember exactly what the target is for the government, maybe 25 or 26.
Yes.
So by then, the Philippines will no longer be eligible for trade preference because it will have, as we call it, graduated in terms of economic development. That said, it's all the more important to see the trade and investment relationship in the overall context and see what we can do next.
Yes.
Well,
That's gonna-
Mr. Ambassador, don't worry. Filipinos tend to stay longer in school and delay their graduation.
Especially where benefits are concerned.
Yes. Well, of course, the next export that we're going to be discussing has to do with the OFWs. But we will go to that conversation after this breather. Keep it here on the Chiefs.
Welcome back to the program, and still with us here in the studio, European Union Ambassador to the Philippines, Luc Veron. Sir, thank you for staying with us, and always glad to have you here.
Thank you.
Well, sir, earlier there were some concerns raised by the EU over deficiencies in the International Convention on Standards of Training Certification for seafarers from the Philippines. It's a big thing for Filipinos as far as families are concerned, of course. Could you give us an update there?
Yes.
How are we as far as our seafarers are concerned and their accreditation?
There's been a long conversation within the European Union and the Philippines about basically the oversight of the maritime schools in the country and the enforcement of the international standards. And this conversation was concluded recently. I don't remember the exact date, but I think it was in March this year.
April.
By the extension of the recognition of the certificates provided by the maritime schools in the Philippines. It's a big deal. It's a big deal for the Philippines, obviously. I understand that, but it's also a big deal for the EU. We employ 50,000 Filipino seafarers on our ships. So for us, it was also a big deal, and for our economic operators.
But where are we in the process? I mean, where would you say we are? Are we closer? Are we moving in the right direction at least?
There is no process anymore. There was a process that concluded. In other words, for a while, we have had several investigation, monitoring missions from the European Maritime Safety Agency. And there were some concerns that were expressed to the two agencies overseeing the schools, Marina and the Shed. And the European Commission assessed that the replies from the Philippine government were sufficient as for the European Commission to conclude that there was no need to challenge the certification provided by the schools. So the case is over.
Okay. Right, you did mention this is a concern not just for the Philippines, it's a concern not just for the EU for that matter. I mean, the Philippines still remains one of the main suppliers of seafarers worldwide. But I'll just throw it wide open as far as OFWs and also with respect to the EU. Everything else we're concerned about. Of course, we're concerned about the welfare of our compatriots in Europe and in other countries. We're also concerned about how we're taking care of ourselves in the meantime, especially during the pandemic. Our doctors, our nurses, certainly the opportunities abroad. This is something that we've had to contend with also on our end. But at the same time, we know that the demand for our nurses, especially our doctors, our teachers as well for that matter, is something that we also cannot ignore. How do we engage, on the one hand, with the international community, with the global community, and at the same time find some balance for our own ironic concerns here in the Philippines?
I think you're right that the role of the OFWs in the economy of the Philippines cannot be underestimated. It's a very important contribution to the wealth of the nation. The European Union, well, Europe in general, we have 1 million OFWs from the Philippines only, out of 10 million. So that's not the the first destination, if I may say so, for Filipino OFWs, But what is important in my view is also the quality of the contracts that we provide. And this is something that the current government, with the creation of the new Department of Migrant Workers and Secretary Opley has been very keen to pursue, is to have international agreements with partner countries as to ensure the quality and the fairness of the jobs that are provided to the Filipino workers. And this is something that we take very seriously, that our member states take very, very seriously. A number of them have already signed bilateral agreements with the Philippines. And we think that we offer pretty good condition. Because as you say, it's very important also to look at the well-being of the OFWs that have such a major role economically, but it's also be as much as we can respectful of their rights and in any circumstances.
But this is on the side of the welfare of Filipinos going to, and of course we wish them well, and we wish them to do well and to be well and to do good. But what about on the side here of in the meantime our healthcare system cannot retain our own nurses and so on? What is going on between the EU and the Philippines to also to help us mitigate against a shortages here? Let's just call it what it is.
Some of the conventions, bilateral agreements that I mentioned, contain provisions as to the training of OFWs. So these are our new generation, if you wish, labor agreements with third countries, and there are quite a few with EU member states already. This is our way to address this. But of course, this is a debate for Filipinos themselves. And as a foreign diplomat, I would abstain from passing any definitive judgment. I don't see that in the foreseeable future there will be much less OFWs. But at the same time, you have a fast-growing population, and what really matters for becoming an attractive, you have all the assets to becoming a very attractive investment hub in the region. In terms of the economic perspective of the Philippines, is one of the fastest growing economy in Asia. You have a young population. More than half of the population is below 25. You are one of the largest English-speaking countries in the world. A very solid consumption, in part sustained by OFWs.
Right.
So there are a lot of economic assets for the Philippines.
Mr. Ambassador, well, go ahead. You did mention that we have all the elements to be a good investment hub. But let me ask it from a different point of view. When you talk to EU businessmen, what do they say about the Philippines? What do they like about the Philippines, and what do they want to have? I don't know, maybe changed or amended?
Definitely, what they like is what I said: the economic perspective of this country of 112 million people. It's a big market with a young population, a growing active population, working population. So that's definitely an asset. On the other hand, and this is acknowledged by the government, there are a few areas to address in terms of the ease of doing business, the number of permits that you need to start a business here, for example. But this is something the current administration is very aware of, and including the previous administration. I mean, the liberalization of the economy started in earnest under the Duterte administration, as is pursued by the current administration. You also have issues that are being addressed in terms of infrastructures, electricity distribution, connectivity in some part of the country is definitely something that the investors are looking at, and governance. And that's why we are working on the justice sector. If you want redress, if you are a fallout with your Filipino partners, for example, you want to be able to find easy redress in court. So these are being acknowledged by the government. It's part of the Philippine Development Plan, for example, very explicitly. And I'm quite optimistic, actually.
So we're now in the middle of the debate over the Maharlika Investment Fund. And since Ed has asked you about, foreign direct investment opportunities that the EU countries might find here, I just wonder whether, even though we haven't really defined, some experts say, whether the MIF is a development fund
Or a sovereign wealth fund,
an investment fund or an equity fund. I just wonder how you think the perception of in the EU rather would be in terms of a sovereign fund here in the Philippines.
I think it's more a matter for EU investors, and in particular, I'm pretty sure pension funds, for example, in the European Union, are looking at opportunities, and this is for them to vote with their money, if you wish, not for the public sector to determine.
But still along those lines, without going to politics of it, there's been a lot of discussion in the Philippines about liberalizing the economy some more, especially when it comes to ownership of business and investments.
Yes.
What do European businessmen look for when it comes to that? Do they look for example, full equity in investments, or do they?
I never heard an investor that said to me that the fact that you cannot own the land in the Philippines would be an impediment to investment. The liberalization, for example, in terms of renewable energy for 100% ownership, foreign ownership, is something that was very much welcomed by European investors. So I think it's heading in the right direction. It's a matter of consolidating the comparative advantage of the Philippines in the region, principally in the region. So ought to be the best offer in Asia.
Okay, Mr. Ambassador, you know me. You know I would be remiss not to ask you this. We have talked about the human rights and
Yes.
democratic institutions here and the situation here. I want to bring it specifically to the question of media as well. The EU, of course, is a very, very big supporter of promoting press freedom in the Philippines. I say this as as you know, I am involved with I'm an advisor to one European organization, International Media Support in Denmark, and so it is also coming from that place. But Mr. Marcos has, among other things, very early on, he said very explicitly, for example, one case that the whole world looks at, Maria Ressa. He said very explicitly, I don't think Maria Ressa is going to prison. Which is, I think, that's the president speaking. So you would like to think that that's a very good signal. On the other hand, you have a journalist, French May Cumpio, in the Visayas, who has been languishing in prison for more than 2 years already. You look at the ABS-CBN, that was a congressional matter. It no longer is, but the recent developments seem to be that the Lopezes cannot simply just come back into business. Politics still comes into play. You have the Speaker of the House and a company related to him. It looks like now being invested in some of the assets that will be in the fallout of this ABS-CBN crisis. And yet, at the same time, as we said, it is a totally different climate. I'll have to be very frank about that. It was much, much more chilling, certainly during the time of Duterte. So I think I'm trying to be on balance here. On balance, your assessment, sir, as on the media situation, on the matter of free expression, given that on the one hand, the rhetoric, the words, some would say lip service, at the very least is there. But on the other hand, you have very tangible indicators that there is still pressure. I'll mention red tagging as well. We just talked about this in the previous episode, that some of these fundamental things are still very much real for Filipino journalists and the entire Philippine media landscape.
What I believe is true is that the media situation in the Philippines is better than in many, many places in the world, much better. But every attack on the media or on journalists is something that we should denounce. And the European Union has always been quite vocal, as you said, to defend journalists. Journalists are not the only victim of political violence in the Philippines. There are others. And what is important is that there is no impunity. So I circle back to my point that it's something which is recognized by the government of the Philippines. The delivery of justice has to be improved, is being improved incrementally. And this is something that is very important for journalists, for investors, for all citizens. So this is, we will continue to advocate for justice.
And to echo what you said, as you said, it is not just about journalists. That was not my intention to elevate us beyond other sectors. But speaking of other sectors and other people and other entities, Senator Leila de Lima, is that a case of particular interest? And do you take her fate as an indicator of the direction of the Philippines?
This is definitely an emblematic case that has been monitored in particular by our legislators. Senator de Lima was a sitting member of the Senate of the Philippines when she was put in detention more than 6.5 years ago. So it's no mystery that legislators in European Parliament, but other political actors in Europe have been vocal in supporting her case and supporting her release. So this is something that we'll continue to raise with the government of the Philippines, and more publicly, I'm sure our legislators will continue to make the case for Senator de Lima. Actually, each time a senior visitor, whether the European Parliament Subcommittee on Human Rights, whether the EU Special Representative of Human Rights, last week or 10 days ago, the Netherlands Ambassador for Human Rights visited Senator de Lima in Camp Crane, and it was never denied to any of our visitors. So that was the opportunity also to hear directly from her, rather than through intermediaries, where she was after 6.5 years in detention, and to hear her determination to be vindicated, because let's not forget that she has not been sentenced.
Yes. Okay, I want to end on a more fun note, and that's tourism. Because, a big part of our tourists actually come from the EU. And,
Yes.
and I'm wondering how that can be further enhanced, especially, again, under the new administration. Can we see more EU tourists coming to the Philippines? And this despite the issues we have had with our airports and our airlines. How's that coming along?
I think this is a question of strategy for the Department of Tourism, where they want to place the Philippines in terms of mass tourism or in terms of more niche tourism, because wherever I go, and I travel a lot in the country, which, by the way, no need repeating, is a beautiful country.
Yes.
I have visited 37 provinces so far.
Oh, talo tayo. You've beaten us.
And,
That's
have 50
literally
more to go.
every. But among those 37, that represents each region as well. You've been to.
oh
every
yeah,
region?
absolutely.
Wow,
From east to West Mindanao to the entire Visayas and
Isang libot, isang
and
tuwa.
northern Luzon and the Palawan. I've been to 37 provinces. So this is a beautiful country, and everywhere I go, I see European tourists.
Yes.
Not in great numbers, but you have divers, for example, coming all the way from Europe for
Right.
a week in Coron.
That's right. They're into discovery and exploration, right?
But they
Most
have
of
to
these
overcome
Europeans.
sometimes long transits in
Yes.
in Manila.
Yeah. Can I ask you, on the other side of
for Holo and Basilan. Different places for diving.
Yeah. But I
Favorite haunts.
I have a question going the other
Tawi-Tawi.
way.
Or Tawi,
I have a question going the other way. I remember an announcement. I think I saw it on Twitter and on the news that you can either now or soon apply for a Schengen visa from any embassy, something to that effect. That it's no longer having to apply to.
The point of entry?
But the visa in general, it's now going to be a simplified application system.
Yeah, I think it's quite simple, and we have 16 EU embassies currently in Manila, and soon to increase further, I'm told.
Wow. Really?
So we'll have a lot of opportunities for Filipino to apply for Schengen visas.
Why do you say you're told there will be an increase in EU embassies? Like, is Ukraine?
I cannot speak for you. I cannot speak for you.
He would be interested.
I cannot speak for you in the States, but I think at least one or two are planning to open a diplomatic mission here on the top of the 16 we already have.
All right.
Okay.
EU Ambassador Luc Ferron, always a pleasure, sir. Thank you, and once again, welcome to the studio. We've been telling you, come here.
Thank you.
That was great. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you
Thanks,
so
sir.
much. And that is it for the Chiefs. Ako po si Robbie Alampay.
We hope what was discussed here will keep the conversation going. I'm Lucy Cruz Valdez.
I'm Ed Lingao. We are One News, all sides, all the time.